Well, good morning, everyone. I think wherever you are, it's morning. So that's accurate. I'm JoAnn Kamuf Ward, and I'm one of the current co-chairs of the U.S. Human Rights Network UPR Task Force, and there's a number of members from the task force on this call today. And our goal for this discussion is to reflect on something that just ended an hour ago, the Biden-Harris administration's first appearance at the UN Human Rights Council to talk about its human rights record. And for those of you that love acronyms and human rights mechanisms, this is part of the Universal Periodic Review process, by which the UN Human Rights Council reviews the records of all UN member states. And this process, as many of you might recall, really started quite some time ago. Civil society contributions were made in 2019. The US was supposed to be reviewed in spring of 2020, and that was delayed due to COVID. The US review happened in November under the Trump administration. 347 recommendations were made to the US on a huge array of topics, and all of this information is on the US Human Rights Network website, so I'm not going to go into all the details, but we will be sharing out some of the resources. So 347 recommendations were made in November, and today, the Biden administration sat at the virtual table to discuss what recommendations it would accept, what it would reject, and what it would, in human rights legal terms, support in part. What we have today is speakers who have been following this process, engaged in this process, and thinking about how human rights at the national and state and local level impact all of our everyday lives, what was said and what wasn't said during this process, in particular today at the UN Human Rights Council. So I am going to turn the microphone over to my colleague Donna Murray from Gyrlz and Guys to really introduce the who will be speaking today and the goals of the event. And let me just foreshadow kind of the agenda is that we'll have a few planned remarks from the US Human Rights Network and from several members of the task force and working groups who were part of this process. And then we plan to open it up for a more collective discussion about what we saw and heard and where we go from here. So Donna, I will turn it over to you, and folks can use the chat for questions.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for showing up this morning and for all of you all's contributions thus far. Thank you, JoAnn, for introducing me. I am Donna Murray, the Gap Girl, and my mantra is I fill in the gaps, I identify the gaps, I bridge the gaps, and I eradicate the gaps. And one of the greatest examples of this is just having this platform this morning. Some people have an understanding that some things have to be done. And I wanted to hear from you all after the conversation, because listening to 347 remarks, hearing that over 200 of them were accepted, some were rejected, but then some were noted. And that's what we deal with all the time, is that there is some formality, there is an occasion where everybody gets to say all of the kind words. But for many of us, we are working in this project, whether it's with a corporation, an institution, with ourselves, with other people, because we are passionate about the reason that led us to this human rights work in the first place. What led me there is a woman of color who had dealt with civil rights, women's rights, and every time a door closed or I had to find a gap, I was like, where is it that I don't have to keep explaining myself? And it led me to the human rights conversation. So that's where we'll begin today. I am going to introduce my co-chair, Mr. Joshua Cooper, who is the person who discovered me as the Gap Girl and said, your perspective on the way you present a conversation and your calm with addressing it is necessary. And you introduced artificial intelligence from a perspective that we need to hear. So I would like to introduce Joshua Cooper so he can tell about the interconnectivities of these conversations and guide us along with the process of giving you your right to speak. Thank you.
Mahalo. Thank you so much, Donna. And it's great to see everyone on this morning. It's a day that many of us had been hoping would happen a while ago. And we know that now today on March 17th, the US finally accepts or rejects or accepts in part 267 of those 347 recommendations. One of the important things of human rights that we are all working on is demanding that the world listens to the voice of directly impacted peoples and communities, and that we can coordinate a new direction forward. What's very important as we look at this is really the pandemic did expose all the economic, social, and cultural rights that we've been clamoring for a very long time. And why we're gathering here today, immediately afterwards, is to make sure that the voice of civil society is once again heard loud and clear throughout the world, and to make sure that we can respond, and more importantly, plan a roadmap to realize human rights going forward. We know this is the phase when most of us usually go back to our other 2 or 3 day jobs related to human rights, because it's been such a long time that we've been concentrating on the UPR process. But I can really see a dedication to demand dignity, and for us to make sure that we hold the State Department, all the federal agencies into accountable measures that we can then build this national human rights movement even stronger. And I now will hand it to the co-executive director so that Vickie Casanova can share the US Human Rights Network statement. And then we'll hear from many others who did have their intervention heard from civil society side, as well as those that were on the list a little bit later. But what we know is every voice is important. And I now hand it over to Vickie.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and good morning, everyone. We thank you very much for being present to help continue the process, which is the people-centered human rights movement. We know that all eyes have been on the US today with regard to this culmination in some people's minds of a couple years of advocating and stakeholder reports and side sessions and testimony to the UN and convening and organizing in cities and communities to define for ourselves what it is that must happen to fully realize human rights for people right here at home. I am the new co-executive director for the US Human Rights Network, have been a very active member for almost all of its 17-year history. The network is a national network of organizations and individuals, lots of grassroots participants working to strengthen a human rights movement and culture right here in the United States that is led by the people most directly impacted by human rights violations. So that's why you will be hearing today as well from our member, colleague, partners, friends who have experienced firsthand some of the most egregious human rights violations, and want to help you understand that the world can't wait, right? We understand that many of the human rights violations are a result of decision makers and governments putting profits before people. So the planet cannot wait, and we as individuals cannot wait, because the end result of unchecked human rights violations ultimately for peoples is genocide. So very quickly, just today, as you heard from the panelists and my colleagues, what happened was a very formal adoption of the United States of a majority, which is a good thing, a majority of those almost 350 strong recommendations which came to the US from the bodies of the Universal Periodic Review, which were responding in part and reflecting the advocacy of the people power to continue to make sure that we are lifting up those most egregious and everyday human rights violations. So the question for most people, including those of us who have been engaged for some years in the lead up to this critical decision point, is this: after today, what does that mean? It's nice to adopt some, but the proof is in how you implement. So it's going to continue to require the efforts of organizations, individuals, grassroots people, and progressive business leaders, as well as government, to take this seriously, walk the talk. And so the question we've asked is how to hold the people accountable who have the power in their hands, whether city, community, or national level, to follow through on these promises to reverse this trajectory of the last 4 years. This is a promise that the United States must keep. So we applaud them for adopting a number of recommendations and for noting others. But what about those that were totally ignored? They're not without merit. So we are going to keep our feet to the fire. The US must fully engage in the human rights arena, starting right here at home. The Human Rights Network, really through this member-led Universal Periodic Review Task Force, is speaking to you to say, at whatever level you can work, please work with us. We want to make sure that this long list of international and domestic violations that was a result of the lengthy process does not just fall by the wayside. So we have now our marching orders, which is to help demand what will ensure that the universal international human rights standards for all human beings and our planet are fully enforced. And that does include, in part, an establishment of a National Human Rights Commission. We invite you to continue to press forward for future action that includes transparent, inclusive engagement of US civil society, because we are the key. This is not something that just happens at a superficial or a government level. We have to implement human rights on the ground, and that requires leadership and full participation of civil society, which is us. We thank you so much for being here. I ask you not to just listen, but to really commit to taking action and working together in unity so that we can truly bring human rights home to the US. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joshua, I'm going to turn this back over to you as moderator. I know we have a number of people that we really want to hear from and to understand how to work together with going forward to implement human rights.
Yes, thank you so much, Vickie. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Nadia. Rhee will be our first speaker. And thank you so much, Nadia, for joining us this morning.
Good morning, and thank you so much for giving me this space. I am representing a coalition of organizations in the US that all are concerned with the rights of sex workers and transgender people. These groups include New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance, of which I am a committee member, the Outlaw Project, Desiree Alliance, the Black Sex Worker Collective, and BPPP. This morning, the United States officially announced its response to the 347 recommendations of the most recent UPR. They spoke about trans rights, women's rights, and ending violence. It was a re-engagement in the UN process, but the US has failed to protect and respect the human and labor rights of sex workers and genuinely end the criminalization of trans lives and sex workers' lives. It is a human rights disaster. This month alone, the US records the loss of another transgender woman, Diamond Kyrie Saunders, who was killed on March 3rd, 2021. And just yesterday, an armed man walked into 3 workplaces. These were massage parlors or spas in Atlanta and killed 8 people, 6 of them Asian women. Today, recommendations specifically speaking to defend the rights of transgender women of color have been accepted by the United States. This includes Recommendation 148 by member state Malta, which recommended to strengthen measures to prevent and combat violence, especially the rate of murder experienced by transgender women of color. Recommendations from Belgium and France also strengthen what the U.S. should be doing to end the discrimination against transgender people in credit, education, employment, housing, jury service, public accommodations, and taxpayer-funded programs. In the implementation phase in the coming years, our coalition insists and demands that the U.S. implement policies to end the criminalization of trans lives, including ending the policing and criminalization of sex work that forms so much of the basis for incarceration and marginalization of trans people. Violence against trans people cannot be ended until this criminalization of their lives end. Everyone in our coalition wants to bring attention to Recommendation 86, which the United States accepted in 2011 to end violence against sex workers and trans people. This recommendation is in line with many of the recommendations about policing and the policing of Black lives in the U.S. Um, that the U.S. received in November last year and has just accepted today. The implementation phase must include the United States ending state-sanctioned violence caused by the criminalization of Black bodies. This includes Black sex workers' lives and their livelihood. Sadly, in the last 5 years, the U.S. has pursued policies that directly contradict the commitment to Recommendation 86. In particular, a new federal law that silenced online communication about health and rights of sex workers and prevent sex workers from organizing and peacefully assembling. In light of the acceptance today of Recommendation 271, requiring that the United States investigate any allegations of the excessive use of force by law enforcement officials and to reduce restrictions on the right to peacefully assemble, we encourage the United States to end the legal barriers of sex workers to assemble by repealing laws such as FOSTA and SESTA that were passed in 2018 under the previous administration. Given the U.S. acceptance of so many recommendations about the rights of immigrants, we encourage the United States to eliminate anti-prostitution and anti-immigration policies that undermine the protection of the human rights of sex workers in border areas. We note that the acceptance of Recommendation 236, that the United States take further measures to prevent, investigate, and punish excessive use of force by law enforcement against and including minorities and migrants at the border. Our collective has documented extreme levels of violence against sex workers in the southwestern border areas perpetrated by border agent Juan David Ortiz. In 2018, in a matter of 10 days, he brutally murdered 4 migrant sex workers and left their bodies in remote areas along the Texas-Mexico border. A 5th managed to escape and reported the violence to law enforcement. Border agents who feel free to abuse, rape, and murder people because they are sex workers must be held accountable in the implementation of this recommendation. The Sex Worker Coalition recommends that the United States immediately address the rights violation at the border that impacts sex workers and no longer use sex work policy as a tool to punish migrants overall. I thank you all so much for allowing me this platform to speak, and I will be happy to answer any further questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, NJRUA, for really addressing how really at the adoption, our work really begins, and we must continue moving going forward. Just the example of what happened yesterday in Atlanta also points out all the intersectionality of all these human rights issues, that we have a gun violence pandemic, that we have people's lives not being respected, that we have to stand up continuously to address these, and then giving the examples of linking to the actions on the border as well, with those stunning statistics that too many people have forgotten that must be at the center of the actions as we move forward. I now wanted to hand it to Denice to continue, and then we know everyone will just stand up and speak and share their perspectives for the next half hour. Denice.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. So my name is Denice Labertew, and my statements today reflect the collective work and concerns of Women Lead Network, a collective of women committed to centering women's experiences in human rights discussions, and also the Women's Rights Working Group of the US Human Rights Network. When we center women's experiences, we include all who define themselves as women, as well as other birthing and menstruating people. Throughout the Universal Periodic Review, the Women's Rights Working Group consistently raised the issues of women in the United States by bringing forward three themes: maternal mortality, reproductive access, and gender-based violence. Women Lead Network centered the intersectional experiences of women related to these issues by focusing our attention on women and girls in US immigration detention. It's with significant relief that we're able to move forward on these issues under an administration that has promised to look at and address many of the concerns we've raised to date. But to be clear, our work is not done. Many of the issues raised by women related to their health, safety, and well-being were issues long before the previous administration and continue to be critical for women to enjoy full access to their humanity. Today, in the Biden administration's response, we learned that they intend to develop a plan to fully implement laws that prohibit sex discrimination and to include sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, and to address gender inequality, including a willing focus on reproductive health access for women, quote, at home and abroad. They've committed to addressing racial justice and other forms of discrimination and have begun instituting various policies, including anti-bias training. They've committed to humane immigration practices, in particular for children, as well as criminal justice reform. They've committed to, quote, meaningful engagement with tribal communities when policy decisions are made. And in terms of ratification of instruments like CEDAW, they've stated that they agree with them from a policy perspective and are committed to working towards ratification. They talked about COVID-19 and have committed to meaningful access to healthcare, including making it, quote, more affordable and to protect reproductive healthcare for women. We also heard comments praising the US for its shift in its position on women's reproductive rights at a global level and its commitment to addressing gender-based violence, and also some questions about the lack of commitment to some issues impacting women like paid parental leave and continued confusion on the Helms Amendment, which frustrates efforts towards women's well-being internationally. All that's great, but we remain concerned that the lived experiences of women have not been fully reflected in their commitments. For example, we did not hear any specific intention to address the human rights of women in detention settings, whether prison or immigration detention, who have been sterilized without consent or sexually assaulted by their detainers. We did not hear about a commitment to ensure full access to healthcare for every individual in order to reduce maternal mortality, which disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous women. While we heard some commitments to include protections for sex workers and trans women who are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence, as we just heard, right, from our previous speaker, specific criminalization of sex work continues. And we heard no mention of how to address the impacts of COVID-19 for women specifically, whose job loss has constituted 80 to 100% of reported job losses some months during the pandemic, who are disproportionately caregivers, including informal caregivers who have not been prioritized for vaccines, are a majority of healthcare providers who will have long-lasting effects from the trauma of the pandemic, or how to address the profound impact of the gaps to women's careers and education due to their disproportionate responsibility for at-home teaching of children during the pandemic. It's critical that we remember that while the US may return to its status as a, quote, global leader in human rights, the experiences of its own women must reflect that position. It's also critical that we remember that the lived experiences of women in the United States intersect with many of the issues most impactful in all communities: criminal justice, workers' rights, racial justice, healthcare access, clean water, land. All of these impact women specifically. So we call on the Biden administration to engage with grassroots women's groups to facilitate ground up solutions to all domestic problems, to ensure that diversity is not simply a catchphrase and that women of color are centered as leaders in solutions to domestic and international problems, and also that they apply a gendered lens to each and every problem and solution that's presented, specifically looking to the impacts of any policy, position, approach, or action on women in all of their varied experiences. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you so much, Denice, and also thank you, Jamil, for.
Thank you, Denice, and thank you. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Thank you all. Both of those statements were so impressive to me, not just because of the content and the level of preparation and the passion that you all introduced, as well as the statements that Vickie made. This is an intersectionality of a parallel world right now. So when I say those are terms, we do have a country that is handling things domestically and internationally far different. And we are really being a hypocritical nation right now because we have so many areas that are in violation every single day in this COVID pandemic. What I would like for you all to tell me, though, is what steps can we take to make sure that these recommendations that have been adopted are implemented? So from both of you all three of you ladies' perspective, how can we go forth with making sure the United States is held accountable to their adoption, not just in theory and in action, but in practice, but in actually doing something and doing something that address our independent needs? Because you all basically did talk about things that are really affecting people who identify as women, however, from a very diverse perspective. So answer the question from your perspective: how do we move forward, and what can we do for you to support you all to make sure your perspective gets included in the actions?
Najela, do you want to respond first, or?
I think one of the most important things that can help the fight for equality is supporting the voices of sex workers and transgender people, and listening to what their needs are, or what our needs are. And also, I believe because of the stigma of sex work and all the intersections of the communities that are involved in sex work, there's a tendency to belittle our points of view and not take our advocacy seriously. So you have a lot of these NGOs who try to make appeals on our behalf, but end up advocating for laws and structures that criminalize us um, in in the name of protecting us. So now you have a system where sex workers can experience things like having their uh, uh, access to money restricted, whether that be PayPal or Cash App, or even big banks suddenly freezing or taking their funds without warning, and that being something that is completely legal and acceptable to do. Or you have the part of the prison industrial complex that has rebranded itself as rehabilitation for sex workers, which is really just incarceration by another name. So I think what would really help uh, our communities is for those outside of the community to uh, relinquish the power over us. So when we are advocating, when we're asking, when we are uh, collectively saying these are things that will make us safer, like repealing FOSTA SESTA, or you know, uh, making sure that sex workers aren't losing custody of their children simply for the fact they're sex workers. We need to be at the forefront of these conversations, and we need to be listened to, and we need to be respected.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Denice?
I can, yeah, I think that Najela actually said something that's really critical and that should, in my view, be part of our consciousness, not only as we do advocacy with the Biden administration at a local level around human rights, but also within our own communities. And that is really assessing who's speaking for whom, right? Who's standing up for whom. And I think it was Megan, right, that put it in the chat, nothing about us without us. And so I included this in my recommendations just generally, and that is really, number one, looking at issues as being intersectional, right? So often we talk about women's rights as being reproductive rights, but women's rights go way beyond, right? Or women's gender justice goes way beyond reproductive access, although it's fundamental, right? It goes into workers' rights, it goes into criminal justice, abolition, right? And all of those issues. So really to think about each of the issues that we are working on every day in terms of human rights from an intersectional perspective. But also this important conversation, which I think Najela started, around who sits at the table and who's willing to cede space at the table. And it's clear that there are, from a policy perspective and an international perspective, only going to be so many voices that are allowed to sit at the table. I mean, I think that we saw that only 10 out of, I mean, what, like 30 or 40 something NGOs were allowed to even say something this morning. And so to be really aware in our own communities about ceding space to folks who have less access to power, to ensure that voices are being centered, who are disproportionately impacted. And so I think, you know, really to think about, to sort of wrap up my comment, to think about all of the issues that we care about as being intersectional in a lot of ways, but also to be willing to cede our own power, right? Cede our own space at important tables in order to make space for other folks who don't have that access.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I may share from the U.S. Human Rights Network perspective, which is we, right? It's everybody here. Part of the concept of that work is also, in addition to, you know, who's at the traditional table, just like bringing our own table as well, right? Donna spoke a minute ago about kind of this parallel process. And, you know, the Universal Periodic Review, which we're talking about today, the UPR, is just one of several international and locally relevant interventions and mechanisms, as we know, as part of the human rights frame. So, you know, we also have opportunities to make sure that the voices that need to be centered are accessing the, you know, the CERD, the Convention Against to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the CAT, the Committee Against Torture, right? ICCPR, which is civil and political rights, as well as those that have not been ratified by the US, which is part of our continual pressure as well, like CEDAW, right? How do you not ratify the protection, the treaty to protect against discrimination, you know, against women, as well as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC. Again, the United States, you know, peerless leader, is the only nation that cannot see fit to ratify this treaty. So the human rights, courageous member leaders of the US Human Rights Network have basically said, okay, but we are going to learn about, educate about, and apply those human rights that we now know that we do in fact have, that are relevant and applicable in the US as well. Even our Constitution holds treaties and civil law, right, up, and we just have to continue to access those mechanisms, because what we've learned in the human rights cities and communities movement that is also emerging through people power is that irrespective of, you know, what happens with this beautifully packaged acceptance today, if that goes on a shelf, or, you know, which we're not going to let it, but if things are slow and stalled because there is so much other work that has to be done right now by this administration, then the people do not stop. And I see Christine's input in the chat that CEDAW actually did not help sex workers in their recommendations, right, on migrant women. And so once again, have to continually be aware, even within this movement, of the need to decolonize, right? We have to decolonize our work. We have to decolonize how we show up, and also just free our minds from what we're told the norm is and what we're told is possible. And through that, we will win. It's not going to be easy, obviously. But the last thing I wanted to say is, for sure, no more about us without us. I first learned that within the network from formerly incarcerated women, right, who were really accustomed to having all their quote unquote rights stripped away and their voices co-opted. And what we do know, however, is to be real true advocates, these forums are really, really critical, because we are educating each other. And then because of the intersectionality, the next time I have the opportunity to talk about, you know, the right to family and the separations that occurred at the airports as well for those families that were from Muslim banned, countries, I can also talk very intelligently about those border issues, including the egregious violations against sex workers now, because we've educated each other. So stay strong and do continue to please work with this human rights frame. That's the only way we can hold our government accountable, and also our other leaders, even at the communities level.
Thank you, Vickie. Right now, we know that there's less than 20 minutes before the next side event. So what we would like to do is open it up for the next 15 minutes for people to just make a one-minute statement to say what your response is. What did you feel you wanted to say if you had a platform? And you can just raise your hand and Joshua will let you in. Be mindful, because the more we're respectful of that, the more people that get to add a comment. Thank you so much.
Mary, would you like to go? Thank you, Mary.
I would, thank you. And relative to all of the issues that have been brought up relative to racial injustice, relative to women's rights, I think the intersectional issue here is healthcare, which in the past, the Obama administration actually resorted to calling healthcare a measure instead of a right, because we don't provide healthcare, we only provide health insurance, which does not give people access to care. And I think that during this time of pandemic, in responding to recommendations 295 and 313, when the US government said they would like to, basically what they said is they would like to expand access to healthcare. There shouldn't be, I mean, it's Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and other marginalized communities that are suffering the most during this pandemic. So why is the US government not, at this crucial point in time, recognizing that healthcare is a right? Health insurance is not a right because it doesn't help you any, because frequently you can't use it. Healthcare is a right, and they need to recognize this. And all of the grassroots groups that I'm working with, as well as the umbrella groups that have spoken today, know that it is a right and it needs to be recognized as such. So we need the help of all the other nations in bringing that home to our United States government and not letting them use American exceptionalism as an excuse for not providing universal health care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. And also note JoAnn's comment, because we know it's the civil society that actually frames and claims these rights and advances them and moves it and keeps this conversation going, but more importantly, creates the campaigns to make sure that these rights are realized. Christine was the next one that raised her hand, and I'd like to hand it to Christine.
Hi, good morning. I'm Christine Sardina. I'm the director of Desiree Alliance, and we are a national sex worker rights organization. My statement mainly is we wrote for CEDAW on the migration of women and such, and even you know, to accept the recommendations by this administration. I see so much of the intersection of sex trafficking and consensual sex being enmeshed together. And this has to be separated. I mean, there has to be education on that. There has to be, you know, everyone's getting on the bandwagon for this Nordic model, which is to criminalize the buyer and not the seller, but in you know, in roundabout ways that it's actually targeting the sex worker as well. But what we really have to work on is getting this sex trafficking narrative out of consensual sex work, because criminalization, now we have federal laws against it. Now, you know, there's hundreds of state laws. And I mean, this goes all the way back from white slavery to, you know, the war on drugs and you know, how this all intersects. And, you know, this is just getting ridiculous on how the narrative globally is getting to be sex trafficking, save and rescue versus consensual sex work. And there's no distinction in that. So the criminalization of that really needs to be, you know, and I know almost 3/4 of the 347 recommendations said to accept the CEDAW recommendations. Well, the CEDAW recommendations had a lot about sex trafficking and Nordic model in there. So that's something that just, you know, infuriated me for one, but that the people's lack of education doesn't know the difference. And so, you know, public education is also very important, but government education is extremely important in all this. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have Lauren next, and then JoAnn after that.
Yeah, hello. I think she already spoke to it a little bit, what I had been asking. This idea that I'm very, very, concerned about the exploitation of sex workers. And I guess, she actually already spoke to it, this idea that there has to be some distinction between this industry that is exploiting sex workers and the idea of what needs to be done to protect sex workers. And, not having the same expertise as many of the people on this panel, I'm just wondering how, to draw the distinction. And I guess what you could say, people who are not as, integrated into this work, what we can do to help, since we're not on the front lines, like some of the people on this call.
Thank you.
Hi, can I respond? So what I think is most important to remember that, sex worker rights, our fight for decriminalization, it's very much a human right and also a labor right issue. So the same laws that should be protecting all workers should apply to sex workers. It is, stigma and criminalization and good old-fashioned American Puritanism in this country that sets us apart and criminalizes us. It's sex work has been seen for a very long time as something that is especially exploitative or especially dangerous for women, but we don't really talk about that most people that are trafficked are not sex trafficked. They are labor, other labor trafficked. They're domestic workers. They're working in salons. They are factory workers. They are farm workers. So I think what's very important to think about is when you talk about protecting sex workers, to not view it in a lens with this kind of expected paternalism, where we are a group of people that need to be rescued from ourselves and our own decisions, but think of us as humans and laborers that should be having our already established rights respected. So I hope that
Thank you.
helps answer your question.
Okay.
Thanks. Thanks so much, everyone, for your time and your comments, and in particular the recommendations for how to move the work forward. I wanted to just make 2 points that relate, I think, to a lot of the themes that have already been raised, and they're about the way the U.S. actually thinks about its human rights obligations, which is like problematic at its core. The US defines its human rights obligations to be consistent with domestic law. So when the US talks about fighting discrimination, they're talking about enacting laws that make largely intentional discrimination illegal. When human rights law is talking about addressing discrimination, it's talking about adopting measures that are inclusive of everybody, regardless of identity, and policies that take steps to advance equity. So that's like a really significant difference, and relates to the other point, which I think underscores what Mary and others have said. The US does not recognize economic and social protections as legal rights. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I get stuck in legalese and obligation versus commitment, but it matters because it defines what the US policy is doing. And so many people on this call and in many other spaces have been fighting for recognition of these rights for longer than I've been at the table. And this is a fight that I think is so essential, and which COVID has brought these things together, right? We have a failing approach to addressing equality on all grounds, and we have a failing approach to protecting people's ability to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JoAnn, and really reinforcing what many of us have learned by being involved with the network, that we really learn from each other. And then that's the way that we move forward to be able to change and challenge the laws that exist, and then push forward with fresh perspectives that have freedom and human rights at its core. I know we have around 7 minutes before the next side event, but we definitely want to continue the conversation. Was there anyone else that had their hand raised that wanted to share at the adoption?
I was going to ask Jamil if he wanted to speak, because he was one of the task force member. Actually, I was very excited to see 3 people that worked with us, Kerry, as well as Jamil and Nadia, speak today. So you having the opportunity to speak, Jamil, would you make the connection for people who think that is only an opportunity that can be granted individuals that have, quote unquote, connections and power?
Thank you, Donna. I want to thank everyone who spoke before me, and I support their comments and recommendations. I think it's really important to hear their voices. We got to speak this morning because we have so-called consultative status with the UN. Not all organizations, unfortunately, have that. It's very bureaucratic, and it's unfortunate because it also limits the access of civil society voices to the UN. But I agree that we should be thinking ways of expanding that. That's why I prefer to listen to this morning conversation and learn from you all. I would just say one thing is that we really need to do everything to translate what we heard or what we saw today into the US. And I think the US government changed some of the tone we heard this morning from the submission that they made earlier this month, where they, for the first time, for example, has used the word systemic racism, which did not use in the document. They called on, for example, express support to the High Commissioner report that will be coming, that's being drafted now, that will be submitted in June on systemic racism and police violence. As you know, last year under the Trump administration, the US lobbied aggressively against this resolution. So I think we need to look at ways that we can work together to support each other as much as possible and to build this human rights infrastructure that we've been talking about for so long. And in my comments this morning, I mentioned too that have been echoed by other organizations, creating a federal transparent mechanism, a permanent one, that will be in charge of helping and coordinating US human rights obligations commitments being implemented. And the second thing is revising the mandate or expanding the mandate of the US Commission on Civil Rights, and to add a human rights mandate so that they can be part of this conversation. So the civil rights and human rights are not siloed, and domestic policy and foreign policy on human rights are not disconnected. We need to make sure that they are connected. So the questions about US complicity in militarization abroad is connected to militarization and oppression of particular communities of color at home. Police violence, a state-sanctioned violence at home, is connected to use of force abroad. These are the kinds of things that we have to do a better job and look for accountability across all communities. So thank you for everyone's comments.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to just raise up one very important point that Mary raised that gives an example of what you're saying, Jamil. It's all interconnected. Having health insurance and not health care at this particular time is really, really one of the reasons so many people died disproportionately from this virus that was largely preventable. And us making sure we understand the terminology specifically and understanding the impact. We keep saying one or the other, but it's both and. And that's what, when we all got together and talked about this and talked about this parallel universe, we were talking about in a galaxy, everything surrounds a sun and a moon, and all of them are all supported by the alignment. Some planets are larger, some are smaller. So I will yield to Joshua so he can just give us a final summations.
Thank you so much, Donna. And I know we're getting into the final moments and the side event will begin, but I think what we really know and what we've learned from the previous 2 UPR adoptions is that this is only the beginning. And I remember Rob, when he first invited Special Rapporteur on housing, and we're talking around the first cycle, you know, we can't just let the report sit. And so as Jamil pointed out, the idea of a national human rights institution rooted in the Paris principles is important. Also now that we have some people that are being nominated to positions at the federal level in the cabinet, we need to have a standing interagency human rights task force that really keeps these recommendations alive. It was great that we heard from sex worker allies and that recommendation 86, I remember when that one was made by Uruguay, and we have to put the pressure on and keep that happening. Also to support and promote the engagement of local officials in the human rights implementation. And JoAnn did a great job at a letter to get everyone to begin to sign on. And it's not something that we let the US government just pick people from attorney generals and the mayors and the governors, national agencies, when one is coming up, but having local officials demand their seat and having active participation. And then it's also to make sure that we really focus on those treaty reviews that will be coming up. We're very confident that CERD on racial discrimination is over 2 years late and it will be coming up. But also Jamil highlighted the Human Rights Council later this week will look at Resolution 43.1 on systemic racism and police brutality. But it's also the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. So we should get active on that and be prepared for our next steps forward. So I know one thing that will happen to when since they've been officially adopted, the UN High Commission for Human Rights will link all of those recommendations to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I know in some other task force events we've had prior, people are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and the US will probably have to look at creating a voluntary national review. And it's one of the only countries not to do that. So there's a lot that's still to be done, but we need to make sure these recommendations are alive and that we hold the US accountable. And I'll then hand it to JoAnn if she'd like to conclude, as we know the other event will begin shortly. But thank you everyone for joining, and thank you also for participating for nearly 2 years now. And unfortunately, half of it being remote, but it's great that no one really gave up and that everyone just got more resilient and continued to participate and find new ways to engage each other, and then also to bring our voice to Geneva. Thank you.
I just want to say another thank you for the speakers, for your insights, for the work that you're doing outside of these spaces, and for making the time, all of you, to be here today, to the U.S. Human Rights Network, to the UPR Task Force members, and to the many, many people that contribute. And I don't know you, but I hope to, and glad to be connected through this work. There was a question in the chat about whether this will be recorded, and the answer is yes. So there will be access to this likely on the U.S. Human Rights Network UPR 2020 website in the coming days. And a final thanks to Idalia, who is our hero, who made this really happen in the final hours last night and this morning, and the U.S. Human Rights Network Coordinating Center. So thanks everyone, and be safe and well.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Donna, Denice,
Thanks.
Penelope,
Donna,
Najela, Vickie.
Thank you.
Task Force, Denice, everyone.
Thank you.
Joshua, JoAnn, Jamil. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to go learn about the racial justice as a foreign policy imperative.
Right. Take care.
I'll report.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.